What is going on, chess YouTube? So in today's video, we're looking at a brilliant game played between a young Gukesh D and a young Arjun Erigaisi at the 2021 Meltwater Indian Qualifiers. And here we go. In the game, Gukesh opens 1d4, Arjun Erigaisi goes knight f6, the Indian defense. Then we have c4, e6, knight f3, and d5, the queen's gambit declined. Now, real fast, this game was played in 2021 when both these players, Gukesh and Arjun Erigaisi, were rated in the mid-2500s, meaning they were not at their peak strength yet, and there are going to be a lot of mistakes by both sides. It's going to be a very fun, exciting, attacking chess game. All right, now here, of course, the two main lines for white are knight c3, heading for the three knights variation of the QGD, and g3, the Catalan opening. Now, instead of either of those options, white goes for a very interesting sideline, bishop g5, immediately pinning that knight on f6 back to the queen on d8. Now, the drawback of this move is black has the option of trading on c4 immediately. D takes c4 is a very strong move for black here. Of course, there are many alternatives. If you want to play it safe, you can go bishop b4, try to transpose to a Rogozin, bishop b7, try to transpose to a queen's gambit declined, or h6 immediately, putting pressure on that bishop right away, and basically forcing bishop takes f6, then queen takes f6. Now, fortunately, Arjun Erigaisi is a very aggressive attacking player, and he does go for the most aggressive line here as black. That is d takes c4, and with this move, we are going to have a very exciting game. I mean, black here is threatening to hang on to the extra pawn with b5 if white is not careful. Of course, white's going to get potentially a very strong pawn center, and the game is going to get wild. All right, now here, what are white's options? He can go e4 immediately, gaining control of the center. That is perhaps the most aggressive option. Beyond that, you can go knight to c3, gaining control of b5, therefore stopping b5 immediately, but black will go b5 sooner or later. For example, the main line is knight c3, a6, e3, and then b5 hanging on to it. And beyond that, finally, the safe option for white is queen to a4, forcing bishop d7, and then winning the pawn right away. But that option is, not as exciting. It is relatively equal and dry. Now here, Gukesh, he plays e4, and this is how you know we're going to have a fun game. Here, obviously, Arjun Erigaisi does go b5. If you don't do that, white wins back that pawn on c4 and gets those beautiful pawns on d4 and e4. That would just be too much. So b5 with this move, black is playing in the spirit of the semi-Slav defense, hanging on to that extra pawn on c4. Now here, white attacks the pawn on b5 with the move a4. Of course, if you take on a4 or go b4, then the pawn on c4 would hang. You remove the defender on b5, and therefore bishop takes c4 would win back the pawn. Now, instead of that, obviously, black does go c6, again in the spirit of the semi-Slav. And now here we have knight to c3 for Gukesh, again piling up on that pawn on b5. Now here, the best way to defend that pawn is simply queen to b6. That way, if white goes a takes b5, then black can go c takes b5 back, and the queen does support b5 at the end of that sequence. And overall, black is doing fine. He does hang on to the extra pawn, but again, there are many crazy ideas there. For example, of course, white can take on f6, doubling black's pawns as the queen is no longer on d8, defending f6. Now, instead of queen b6, here, Arjun Erigaisi, he goes bishop b7. And this move, it turns out, is a little bit of a mistake. It's a little bit inaccurate. Now, this whole line with 4 bishop g5 before knight to c3 is super rare at the highest level. I think Shakhriyar Mamedyarov plays it quite a bit. I hope I got his name right. Mamedyarov, he's a Azerbaijanian grandmaster, I believe. He plays these weird 1d4 openings quite a bit as white, but overall, most players don't play this line as white at the highest level, and therefore Arjun, maybe he's getting his lines mixed up. It's hard to say. Now here, the best way to capitalize on this mistake, bishop b7, is take on b5 immediately. So a takes b5, then c takes b5, then knight takes b5. Of course, black's going to have resources like bishop b4, then bishop takes e4, and so on. But overall, that would be the best sequence for white. Now, instead of that here, Gukesh, he does go bishop b2, and this move is quite a bit weaker. Here, black's going to have ideas based on b4 immediately, but instead, Arjun, he makes yet another dubious move. That is knight b d7. Instead, b4 was the right way forward, driving back that knight on c3. Now, here, again, white's going to have the option of taking on b5, this time followed by e5. That is the strongest move. Instead here, he just castles. Now, with this sequence of moves here, Gukesh, he doesn't want a complicated game. He just wants to get those pawns on e4 and d4, castle, in the spirit of the anti-Moscow line of the semi-Slav. But the big difference here between this and the anti-Moscow variation is normally black has these moves h6, bishop h4, g5, and bishop g3 already on the board, and those moves do favor white as they give white a good target on g5 with the move h4 targeting it. Now here, without those moves played, with the pawn still on g7 and h7, black's king is going to be a lot safer on the king side. For that reason, he can't just go a6, followed by bishop e7 and short castles and so on, and be fine. Now, instead of that here, Arjun, the madman, he goes b4, driving back that knight on c3. Now, of course, the knight is under attack and must move, or you must play the intermediate move e5 here. e5 would lead to insane complications right away. Trust me on that. You can investigate it on your own if you want to. Now, if white wants to move the knight, the best squares are a2 and b1. It turns out they are both equally good, equally playable. In the game, Gukesh does go knight to b1, a fine move, perhaps intending knight d2, knight takes c4, and so on, trying to swoop that knight back into the game. Now, Arjun Erigaisi, h6 is the move, driving back that bishop. Of course, taking on f6 is recommended. If you go bishop h4 instead, then black can go g5, bishop g3, and then knight takes e4, as the knight is no longer pinned to the queen. Therefore, you do have to take on f6 immediately, or you lose that pawn on e4. Gukesh, he knows that. He's playing like a future world champion here, and he does take on f6. Bishop takes f6, then we have knight takes f6, and then knight bd2. Sure enough, rerouting that knight back into the game and threatening knight takes c4. And beyond that, you can just lead the knight on d2, where it does support the e4 pawn. All right, now here, Arjun Erigaisi, what are his options? The computer likes bishop b7, attending short castles, or even a5, bolstering the pawn on b4, but instead he goes for the move c3. A very dubious, very aggressive move. Maybe it will throw Gukesh off guard. Now here, Gukesh, he starts b takes c3, not allowing c takes b2. That would not be good. Now here we have b takes c3 back, and now here, Gukesh. This is a very tough, it's not very tough to find, but it is a tricky move to find. Let's put it that way. If you like puzzles, pause the video, try to find the beautiful idea for Gukesh right here. It is a, very interesting tactical shot. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this, where I hold my breath for 23 minutes straight. All right, now here, in this position, the best move is queen to b3, putting immediate pressure on the bishop on b7, and opting if black wants it, he can take on d2, then you take on b7. Overall, that would work out to white's benefit, and if you don't do that as black, the queen will be in a position to win the pawn on c3, so overall, queen b3 would be the key idea, and it is very thematic in a lot of queen's gambit positions. Now, instead of that here, Gukesh, he goes knight to c4, jumping up with the knight. Now, what is the problem with this? Well, black's going to have a lot of good ways to proceed. Again, bishop e7, intending short castles is excellent, as is rook b8, a prophylactic move designed to play against the move queen b3 from white. That way the bishop on b7 is defended preemptively. And overall, this b-file, the open b-file, is going to be a very important point of contention later in the game. Obviously, queen b3 or rook b1 are coming up sooner or later. Now, instead of those two good moves, rook b8 and bishop b7, here Arjun does go a5, gaining space on the queen side, and maybe his idea is trying to gain control of the a5 square, stopping knight a5 ideas if the queen moves, but overall, a5 wasn't really necessary yet, so this may constitute a wasted move from black. Now here, Gukesh, once again, queen b3 is the idea, putting pressure on the bishop, but also forking that pawn on c3. Instead, rook to b1 played in the game, and now Gukesh will have to be careful about that c2 square. Of course, if c2 is ever supported by another piece, c2 would fork both the rook and the queen, but for now, Gukesh will be relatively okay. Now, of course, the bishop on b7 is being attacked by the rook, therefore rook to b8 is the move defending, and now Gukesh increases the pressure with the move knight c to e5, increasing the pressure on both c6 and maybe even f7. That could be a weak pawn later in the game, as after all, it's already moved 16, and black has not bothered to castle his king. That is not classical chess for you right there. All right, now, Arjun Erigaisi, he plays a move that's very, aesthetically pleasing, let's say. Bishop b4, flying down with the bishop, the Rogozin-style move. But now, look at this. The bishop is acting like a giant pawn on the b-file. blocking the b file, clogging it up, and stopping the rook on b1 from exerting pressure. So, not a bad placement for the bishop, actually. It does defend c3 preemptively. That will make it very difficult for white to win that pawn. I mean, he's going to have to target it with a knight, but this knight on e5 is literally 4 moves away from winning it on c3, and this knight on f3 is 3 moves away. So, overall, black is going to hang on to that extra pawn for a very long time, and keep in mind, black is still up a pawn, that being the pawn he won on c4 that is now on c3. All right, here, Gukesh, he continues knight to d3, jumping back with the knight, that being one of the ideas in knight e5 earlier. It gains access to d3, and now it is pressuring b4. So, knight takes, if I can draw arrows right, knight takes, then a takes, then rook takes is a threat, winning a pawn, and then the pawn on c3, and maybe even on c6 as well, would be very, very weak. So here, obviously, Arjun Erigaisi is going to have to respond. He goes queen to e7, supporting b4 with the queen, stopping knight takes, a takes, then rook takes, as the queen would recapture the rook. Now, here, Gukesh, he increases the pressure, queen to b3, flying over with the queen. Now, again, he is threatening knight takes, a takes, then queen takes. All right, Arjun, he defends. Bishop to a8, not a bad move. Retreating the bishop, that bishop is sort of committed to being on this long diagonal now. It will be very hard to get it elsewhere, but on the bright side, the rook on b8 now does support the bishop, and there may even be some weird discovered attacks later in the game, but for now, that bishop is pinned, as if you move it, say, to d6, the rook on b8 would likely fall. I mean, if it goes d6, it'll be fine, but you know what I mean. You know what I mean. Later, it could be vulnerable. All right, now, in this position, Gukesh, he finds just a shocker of a move. I mean, this move by Gukesh, unbelievable. If you like puzzles, again, pause the video and try to find this beautiful shocker of a move for Gukesh. It is just beautiful. All right, here, of course, he's going to sacrifice the queen on c3. Queen takes c3, the temporary queen sacrifice. The point being, if you take the queen, it turns out the queen is poisoned. If you take it, rook takes b8 is the move, and that's not it. Of course, your only 2 legal moves at that point are queen d8 and king d7. If you go after rook takes and bishop takes, rook takes, then queen d8, obviously you win the queen. And instead of that, if you go king d7, then obviously rook takes h8 wins the rook, and you do win the, let's see here, 2 rooks for the queen. I mean, that would be a fantastic development for white, as in this complicated middle game, his rooks and his minor pieces would synergize really well against the black queen. Now, instead of taking on c3, obviously, he goes for something else. Instead, knight takes e4 is the move, jumping in with the knight, putting pressure on the queen on c3 immediately. Now we have queen to c2, sliding back with the queen, then knight f6, jumping back, and now knight f to e5. Once again, Gukesh with that knight on f5, pressuring both f7 and c6. Now, will Arjun finally castle on move 21? Turns out, yes, he will. Short castles is the move, finally getting his king to safety there. All right, now here, Gukesh, bishop f3, finally getting his light square bishop to a better square. It's been on e2 virtually forever now, and finally now it is opposing the black light square bishop on a8 and also pressuring c6. All right, here, Arjun, how does he respond? In the game, rook f d8 is the move, getting his other rook into the game, and now pressuring d4 as, believe it or not, d4 is currently hanging. It is not defended by anything. Therefore, here, Gukesh, does he want to take on b4, defend d4 somehow? It turns out he does defend d4 with the move queen to c4. Now the queen supports that square, and knight takes b4 is a very serious threat. All right, Arjun, he continues, knight to d5, supporting his bishop on b4. Now we have rook f to c1, getting the other rook into the game. And now here, queen to a7, sliding over with the queen. The point being, if you go knight takes c6, then bishop takes, then queen takes d4, wins the pawn on d4, and the queen would be tremendously active on that d4 square. With that in mind here, Gukesh, he doesn't take on c6 yet. Instead, knight to c5. Now, both these knights are tremendously placed, and they are kind of locking down the position. Of course, the bishop on a8 is not doing a whole lot. It's just defending, and the one on f3 is much better placed so far. So overall here, Gukesh, he is starting to fight back despite still being down an entire pawn. All right, now, bishop a3 is the move, opening up the b file, very interesting, and pressuring the rook on c1. Now, of course, rook takes b8 is a possibility. Instead of that, we have rook to e1 sliding out of the attack, and maintaining the fight for the open b file here. Now here, in this position, black has the option of trading on b1, but it turns out that is not the best idea, as again, you are simply giving up control of the b file to white. Instead of that here, bishop b4 again is the right move, just retreating, but sure enough here, Arjun, he tries to make something happen. He does go rook takes b1, trading the rooks and giving white control of the b file after rook takes b1 back. All right, now here, Arjun, his idea, he wants to trade on c5. Bishop takes c5 was played. White goes d takes c5, opting not to recapture with the queen, as after queen takes c5, then queen takes d takes, the queens would come flying off the board, and that would not be to white's benefit. So instead, d takes c5. Keep in mind, he is down material. He needs those queens to stay on the board to maintain attacking chances. Getting attack going against the black king is going to be his main way of trying to get compensation for, now it's the missing e-pawn, interestingly enough. All right, now here, Arjun, his strongest move is simply queen c7, centralizing his queen a little bit and pressuring the knight on e5, giving it a little tickle attack. Instead here, knight to b4 is the move, jumping down with the knight, and this move is significantly weaker. Turns out here, white has a brilliant series of moves that really do allow him to fight for the advantage. As you can see by the eval bar skyrocketing up here. Let's go back one more time. As you can see, here it was roughly level, and now it's saying white has a massive advantage. So this is quite the big mistake by Arjun, and if you like puzzles again, pause the video and try to figure out what went wrong here for Arjun and what is the right idea for Gukesh. All right, here, Gukesh, the move is bishop to h5. The point being, you are pressuring f7, and it turns out it's really hard to defend. For example, if you go g6, white can actually just go bishop takes g6, the point being after f takes the pawn on e6 would have. And instead, if you go rook to f8, then you can just completely suicide your knight on f7. Knight takes f7, the point being after rook takes, queen takes, you win 2 pawns, and eventually the rook on f7, as it is pinned to the king, and you are setting up bishop takes f7. So overall, bishop h5 starts essentially an unstoppable kingside attack. Maybe not unstoppable, but it's very, very strong, and you would win material very fast. Instead here, h3 is played by Gukesh, a simple waiting move, perhaps giving his king some loft on h2 if it needs it later in the game, and getting out of back rank mating ideas, which could be coming later in the game. So not a bad idea, just missing the opportunity to go bishop h5, immediately pressuring f7. All right, now, Arjun, queen to c7, centralizing his queen, putting pressure on the knight on e5, as we discussed earlier. That is a fantastic idea. Now we have rook to e1, defending the knight, and now here black has many good moves. He does have to respect the threat of bishop h5. For that reason, ideas like knight to d5 or simply rook f8 do come to mind. Now, instead here, Arjun, he does go bishop b7, and this move turns out is a significant mistake. Again, his idea, he wants to go bishop c8, maybe trying to get his bishop back into the game, but overall, that bishop is just entombed due to these pawns on c6 and e6 here. Maybe he wants bishop a6, I don't know, but overall, it's too slow, and here, Gukesh just goes bishop h5, as discussed, pressuring f7. If black goes g6, you just take the pawn, and again, the complications do favor white. Instead, rook to f8 played in the game, and now here white is going to suicide that knight on f7. Knight takes f7, giving up the knight, but in return, after rook takes, he goes queen takes e6, and now, of course, the rook on f7 is pinned to the king. That means the bishop will capture it sooner or later, and overall, white is going to get 2 pawns and the rook for the knight and the bishop. That is a good trade, and we're actually going to have sort of a level material game here coming up, as we're about to see. All right, now, queen to f4, sliding down with the queen, threatening queen takes f2. That is going to force a trade on f7 with the bishop or the queen in the game. Bishop takes f7 played, and now we have queen takes f7 for Arjun, and then queen d6. Gukesh opting to keep the queens on the board instead of trading on f7. So queen d6 played, then we have knight to d5, and now here it turns out the best move for white is simply queen d8 check, hitting the king, forcing king to h7, and then you go rook to e8, threatening rook h8 ideas. That would force out the king to say g6, and overall, white would have a dangerous attack after queen d8 and then rook to e8 next. Instead of that here, rook b1 played in the game, a slightly dubious idea. As you can see by the eval bar kind of collapsing on the left, it does pressure b7, but overall, it is quite a bit weaker. All right, now, king to h7 played for black, getting his king off that back rank. That is the best move, so hats off to you, Arjun Erigaisi. Now, rook to b3, the rook lift, potentially intending rook f3 or rook g3. Perhaps that was part of the idea of rook b1 played earlier, as, rook e3 would not be possible immediately as the knight covers it. Therefore, rook b1, then b3, and then swing it over is the idea for Gukesh. All right, now here, the best move for black is bishop c8, finally getting the bishop back into the game on this diagonal. That would be very strong. Instead here, knight to b4 played. Not a bad move, trying to defend b7 preemptively, but a little bit slower and a little bit weaker. Now here, rook to e3 is played by Gukesh. Turns out rook f3 is a little bit stronger, but rook e3, not bad at all. Now we have knight d5, jumping back with the knight, hitting the rook on e3, and here Arjun is kind of saying, there's not a whole lot I can do productively. I'm kind of going back and forth with my minor pieces and, kind of playing a waiting game, kind of playing for a draw. Gukesh senses that. He goes rook to f3, pressuring the queen. This guy is playing for a win at all costs. All right, now Arjun, queen to e8, sliding back. Then we have king to h2, and then bishop c8. Finally, that light square bishop is coming back into the game. Very important. Now we have rook to f8, sliding down with the rook, pressuring the queen, and this is getting dangerous for Arjun. All right, queen d7, offering the queen trade. Now it turns out you could actually go into the endgame as white. Queen takes d7, then bishop takes, and then the idea is rook to a8, sliding over with the rook, pressuring a5, and there's actually no way to defend the pawn. Therefore, you will get that passed alpha 0 a pawn on a4, and you will have very good chances of just pushing it down the board and playing for a win that way. Instead here, Gukesh, he keeps the queens on the board with a very aesthetically curious-looking move, rook d8. I mean, sandwiching the queen in between the rook and the queen. You don't see that very often, so very interesting-looking setup here. Now we have queen to f5, getting out of the way of that attack. Now rook to f8 again, hits the queen on f5, then queen to e6, sliding back, then queen b8, pressuring the bishop, then bishop d7, rook h7 hits the king, king g6, then queen g3. Got a little bit of a good old-fashioned king hunt going on. Where's the king going to go? In the game, king to f7 is the move. Then we have rook to a8, sliding back with the rook, threatening the a5 pawn. If that pawn falls, then the pawn with a4 will be a passer, and that will be quite dangerous. All right, now here, Arjun, turns out he has very good chances if he finds the move queen to e1, activating the queen on the first rank and also supporting the pawn on a5 with the queen. Instead here, g5 is the move. Trying to get something going on the king side is Arjun, the madman. All right, here, Gukesh, he just takes on a5. Rook takes a5. He's now officially up a pawn. I mean, he was down a pawn throughout most of this game. Well, okay, he's up 2 pawns plus the rook for the 2 minor pieces, but overall, in terms of actual material value, he's roughly up 1 pawn here. That, the rook and 2 pawns being worth roughly 1 pawn more than the 2 minor pieces. All right, now here, Arjun, he continues, knight f4, a slightly dubious idea. Turns out queen f5 and knight f6 were a little bit stronger. Now we have rook to a7, very strong, threatening the bishop and pinning it to the king on f7. Now we have queen d5, centralizing the queen and putting a lot of pressure on g2. Now, if the queen moves, say, I don't know, queen to c3 or something, then queen g2 would be checkmate on the spot, so that is quite dangerous. Now we have a5, pushing the alpha 0 a pawn down the board. You gotta love it. King g6, a6, here we go. Bishop f5, then rook c7, sliding over, making way for that alpha 0 pawn to continue its journey all the way down to a8. Now bishop e4, pressuring g2 with a lot of pieces here, literally 3 pieces piling up on that. But Gukesh, he is not phased. He's not seeing ghosts. He stays cool, calm, and collected like the cucumber that he is. He goes a7, pushing the alpha 0 pawn once again and threatening a8, promoting the pawn to a new queen. All right, here, what is Arjun going to do? He goes queen to a2, guarding the a8 square with the queen. Now if a8, you take the new queen right away, that would be a very short-lived victory. Therefore, here, Gukesh, he's got to find something else. Now, very importantly, the computer finds queen to e3 as being the strongest move here. Instead of that, he goes rook to e7, and at first glance, rook e7 looks very active. You are putting pressure on the bishop. I mean, yes, queen e3 does it as well, but the rook looks very active here. The problem with this move is black has the resource. Bishop takes g2, just winning the pawn. That is what he does. Now, Gukesh, queen to e3, sliding back. And now here, the best way forward for black is simply bishop d5. You won the pawn, then you retreat back to where you started. Mission accomplished. You're doing great. You got a8 covered. Everything is just fine, and the game is level. Instead here, queen to a1 played by Arjun. And here's the problem. Queen to e1 offering the queen trade. If you take, queen takes, then rook takes, and then a8 will promote to a queen. There's no way to get the bishop or the knight back there in time to defend. Now here, queen to a3, you gotta move the queen away. Moving the queen somewhere on the a file was forced, either a3, a4, or a6. They're all somewhat playable. Now we have queen to b1, check for Gukesh. A slight mistake. Instead of queen b1, turns out rook to e6, hitting the king and the pawn on c6 was the right way forward, and that would be devastating for white or for black. Whatever we want to look at it. Now here instead, queen to b1 played in the game, hitting the king on g6, a slight inaccuracy. Arjun is now back in the game. King to f6, hitting the rook on e7, rook to e3, sliding down, hitting the queen on a3. Now queen takes a7, the alpha 0 pawn has fallen. It did its job, distracting black. Now we have queen b2, hitting the king g6, and now it turns out queen c2, continuing the king hunt, is the right way forward. Instead, queen to e5, played by Gukesh. This move is a massive mistake. Here Arjun, bishop d5, finally getting his bishop out of trouble. Now the knight's also free to move, as once you move the knight, you don't lose the bishop on g2. And now Arjun, he's suddenly got an attack going with the two minor pieces and the queen being stronger than the rook and the queen. All right, now here, h4, the other alpha 0 pawn enters the game, trying to soften up that king side. Now we have queen to f7, sliding over with the queen. Now king g1, g4, king h2, knight to e6, jumping back with the knight, king g3, and then h5, blockading the king side. Things are getting very tense. Turns out Arjun has fantastic attacking chances here, but it is not lost yet. All right, queen d6 is the move. Gukesh fighting for activity. Then queen f6, queen e5. Then we have queen takes e5, rook takes, knight takes c5, and now Arjun suddenly is up a pawn. Plus he has the two minor pieces versus the rook. Things are not looking good for Gukesh, the new world champion. All right, rook g5 hits the king. Gukesh trying to fight back. Can he make it happen? If he wins that pawn on h5, maybe he has a chance. But for now, Arjun, he knows that. He just slides the king over, defends h5 still. And what can Gukesh do? He goes rook e5, fighting for activity, but then knight e4 is the move, hitting the king. The king must move. King g2, king g6, king g1, and now knight to d2. What is the idea? It's very simple. Knight to f3 is threatened, hitting the rook and the king. That would be game over on the spot. Therefore, moving the rook is forced. Rook g5 hits the king, but now king to h6. And here in this position, Gukesh, he simply knows when he is beat, and he resigns on the spot to Arjun Erigaisi. Of course, Arjun has the very simple plan of just pushing the pawn down the board sooner or later, and Gukesh, he simply taps out here to Arjun Erigaisi. Wow, what a game between Gukesh and Arjun in the 2021. What is the name of this thing? It is the Meltwater Indian Qualifier. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button. And check out this video right here where I cover yet another one of the best games ever played between Gukesh and Arjun. If you want to see more Indian chess action, check that video out. And by the way, comment down below what you liked or didn't like. I'd love to hear from you. Love to hear your feedback, what you thought of this game. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video.